The next segment that we're going to do on the Buick today is the buffing segment, the final finish. The last video we did the painting with the Stage 3 turbine unit from TP Tools, and that Stage 3 turbine unit sometimes will typically leave a little more gun texture than a painter's used to, and so we will start by getting rid of that gun texture. Typically I will use a hard block. It's a soft block with a hard side. So to get rid of the gun texture, I use 1000 grit and DOSA. This is the black side of the hard block. We also sell this one. It's a little larger, a little harder if you have dirt and other little blemishes that need to be blocked out and straightened out. So we start by doing that, and if you kind of compare that to doing excavating, it's like running the grader over the surface first to get a flat starting point. You want to get that flat level football field before you polish it and make it shine. So that's our process. We black the black side of the block, start with 1000, then I go to 1500, then I go to 2000, and then 2500. Some people will go further. You're more than welcome to. They sell up to 3000 and higher grit sandpapers. And you can continue to refine the surface before you put the pad to it by using whatever sandpaper you're comfortable to. You will actually, as you sand, like a jeweler polishing a diamond, you will start to see it shine even before we put a buffer to it. When we buff, we're going to be using this kit, the Makita kit from TP Tools. We're going to be starting with wool pads. We have a heavy cut wool pad and a soft cut wool pad. We're going to be using Wizard product. This product is their turbo cut. It's a heavy cut compound similar to like 105 McGuire's, and we'll be using that with the wool pads. For those of you who are not comfortable with wool pads, there is a foam pad that's a heavy cut foam pad that you can use with this product that will cut like the wool pad, the heavy cut. Once we do that, we will move on to the foam pad with the finishing cut compound from Wizards. And when that's done, we'll end up doing a glaze, a swirl remover glaze. I use this 3M product with these black pads. So you see the process of the pads and how we're going to buff. But first we'll start with sanding. Okay, so when you buy this polishing kit from TP Tools, this Makita kit, first thing you'll do is you open it up. You'll notice it comes with a curing bag, but also you're going to be using a 7-inch backing plate that comes with this pad. You won't want to assemble it. And assembling is really easy. All you're really doing is putting the handle onto the buffer. It's a variable speed buffer, so you'll see that there's ability to dial it in. So you can pull it out of the box. You have two options for handles. You have this backing plate with the Velcro on it to attach your pads. So literally, I mean, it's as simple as screwing on the backing plate, and whether you're left or right-handed, screwing the handle onto whichever side you prefer. And you are ready to buff. Then you'll see some gun texture from the turbine unit, and we're going to take that out with 1000. We have had the luxury of letting this dry for a couple weeks already. I know in a production shop you don't have that luxury. A lot of times you have to buff the next day after you paint. But you'll notice that the longer you let it cure, you won't see it balling up on the paper. If you see the paint ball up on the paper, you want to stop and let it cure longer, because it will actually put scratches into the paint that you will not be able to sand out with 1000. So if you start to notice paint balling up on the paper, stop, let it dry longer, go back to it at a later time. So again, black side out on the black side down on the pad, and I cross hatch with 1000. When preparing my water, I put a drop of Palmolive dishwashing soap in it, just to help the pad not gathering paint. The nice thing about this pad also, you can use the gray side, use it as a squeegee. And look at your surface. And you run the light across the surface. If you look into the surface and you still see the light reflecting with a little texture, you need to sand more. Again, you don't want to take all your paint off that you just took all the time to put on, but you do want to get it flat before you proceed to the next step of sandpaper. Okay, so now we've switched to 1500 grit sandpaper, and I'm using the gray side of the block. It's a little bit softer. We've leveled the surface, and what we're doing now is progressively bringing the finish up to finer and finer cuts. The 1500, you'll feel soft, you know, it sands a little softer than the 1000 did. And again, I'm cross-hatching it. And you want to sand until you feel as if it's not making any more progress. You don't feel the resistance. And again, the wonderful thing about the block is it doubles as a squeegee. So clear your surface, roll the light across it to see any spots that you might need to go back into with the 1500. All right, moving on to 2000 grit, no block at all, and hand sand. And that allows, now you begin, any little swells, you begin to just level them out. The 2000 will give you the same feel as the 1500. You feel resistance at first, and as you take those 1500 scratches out and tighten the surface tension, you'll feel the sandpaper goes to a point where you can tell you're done sanding. So we're moving on to 2500 grit sandpaper, and again it's the same thing. I tend to finish up in one direction. You'll notice that if you sand in one direction, it's almost like the grain of a wood, and then when you go to buff it, you can look for those scratches. I would like to also mention to not be afraid to change your paper and your water. Constantly check your water. And if it's getting a lot of debris and residue in it, it's time to change it. So change your water pretty much constantly, and change your paper as needed. Don't be afraid to use the paper, because if you don't change it, you can either be working too hard or you can be putting scratches in that you won't be able to buff out. So clean your surface when you're done sanding. Make sure you do get all the sanding dust and water off, because you don't want to be grinding that into the finish. And if you can see, you've already begun to develop a little bit of a shine coming back with the finer grit papers. So your surface, you can sight it across, run the overhead light through the surface, look deep into it to see if there's anything you missed. Make sure it's ready to go before you go on moving to the next step of putting the buffer to it. Okay, with this Makita buffer, you'll notice a rotary that controls the speed, and you also have a calculator on top. I typically like to buff in that 1000 to 1500 range, which puts us, which would put us on the 3 mark. Actually, I back it down to about 2.5, which would put us just under like 1000 to start with. And then as I go to the foam pads, I might bump it up a little bit, mostly by feel, but you don't want to be buffing in all the way up on 6, the 3200 RPM range, because it'll burn through, you know, rather quickly. So keep it down, dialed down to that 1000 to 1500. Again, we're starting with the turbo cut compound. Our surface is clean and ready. It never hurts to wipe it down before you go ahead and put anything to it. Make sure it's 100% clean so you don't grind any debris into your paint. It's always good to wear a mask or respirator of some sort while you're buffing. So you want to work in small areas so you don't get overwhelmed, and also so you can maintain the quality. So we'll work in about a 12 by 12 area. We just buffed it. I wipe off the overage, and if you see some scratches that's still in the surface, when you look into the surface that still look a little deep, you may want to hit it a second time, go over it until you feel that buffer, this compound and this pad have gotten it as smooth as they can. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second step of the heavy cut process. We've moved on to the softer cut wool pad still, and also still using the turbo cut, the heavier compound. And we're going to do basically the same thing over again, and it will continue to refine the surface. Remember to wipe off the debris between each process using a microfiber towel, making sure you get all of the debris off so you don't grind it into the surface. And when you do, you want to look deep into the paint, look at the reflection of the light above you, and roll your eye back and forth so you can see any blemishes that you might have missed. So that completes, so far, what we've done with the heavy cutting. Again, if you're not comfortable with the wool pad, TP Tools sells this heavy cutting foam pad, which you could do with the compound. You could accomplish to this step with this if you're more comfortable. We are now going to move on to the soft buff foam, and we're going to be using the finish cut compound. It's a finer compound, doesn't cut as deep. And it's good to take a detailer and kind of just mist over the pad before you start with this compound. All right, so we have buffed all the way up to the fine compound. We've done the two heavy cut with the wool pad and the finer cut with the foam pad. So now we're ready for a finishing glaze. And what the glaze does is it kind of levels the surface, and they call it like a filling glaze. So sometimes it will like actually fill in any little scratches that might have not really micro scratches that you might not have gotten out in the other process. So today we're using 3M's Perfect It, which is a good product, along with the foam pad. Again, spray it with a detailer before you start using it. Pre-sanding the texture, post-sanding how flat the light looks, how true. It looks like a mirror reflection. This looks like a distorted mirror reflection. Okay. So in review, we have sanded the finish with 4 different steps of sandpaper, bringing it up to the finest grit of 2500. And then we did 4 steps of buffing with the heavy cut with the wool, and the final cut with the foam, and the medium compound, and then the final glaze with the black. And this process is probably the most time consuming of the entire paint job. You need to be patient and not get in a hurry. You'll see spots as you go that you may not be happy with, and you'll go back in and resand. If you see a scratch, let's say the scratch is deep and you have it running this direction, you want to sand against the scratch. Go back in with 2000. If it reveals itself while you're buffing, sand that scratch with 2000. Sand it with 2500 the opposite direction, and go back to buffing. You'll find little blemishes along the way that you need to revisit as you buff, and that's where the patience comes in. But taking your time on this final step is all the difference between a show finish and a mediocre finish.